Did you know after the Supreme Court legalized abortion in January of 1973, a young African American resident in Boston almost went to jail for doing an abortion? Was it a coincidence that the resident was charged in the case? He was charged with manslaughter and not the attending physician. As in the Quinlan case, the resident seems to take the fall. Was it a coincidence that he was black? There was a lot of controversy about this case. Like a lot of these cases that I follow, there's some surprising twists in the case and in the career of the person if you do a long-term follow-up, as I like to do. I'm Gregory Pence. I'm a bioethicist at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, where I've taught and researched for about 50 years. So let's go back in time to when Roe versus Wade first came down. And one of the things you need to understand, both back then and relevant to the later Dobbs decision that overturned Roe versus Wade, is that Roe versus Wade caught people by surprise. It basically said that all the states that had laws banning abortion were illegal because of the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't talk about abortion. The Supreme Court based its decision at the time on the right to privacy. Now, the right to privacy is a kind of a misnomer for the right to personal liberty, the right to control your life and body, which is implied in the Constitution, but it's never explicitly stated. The 9 Supreme Court justices of the time were kind of taking a leap of interpretation, saying that this right to privacy, this right to personal liberty was so broad that states could not make any law about abortion, especially a woman's right to control reproduction, was supreme up until viability, which we'll talk about in a minute. This was controversial because abortion had not been struggled with in legislatures or in popular elections. It caught a lot of people by surprise. It caught the people of Boston by surprise, and Boston is a heavily Catholic city. So after the decision, there was a local hospital called Boston City Hospital, which cared for a lot of poor patients. It's actually the model for a hospital called St. Elsewhere that was in a fictional TV series about the same time. So once the Supreme Court decision had been made, some doctors at this hospital decided to do some very controversial experiments on fetuses who were going to be aborted. They basically were trying to see if drugs went from the mother across the placenta into the fetus, which is a helpful thing to know. There was a drug called thalidomide that had only been studied in animals, and in a very famous case of Sherry Finkbein, her baby was born without any legs or arms because thalidomide did cross the placenta. It was an anti-nausea drug, and it was very dangerous to fetuses. The researchers at Boston City College did these experiments. In one, they were trying to do to start to develop an artificial womb. They took a fairly large fetus that had been live born, put it in this saline solution to kind of mimic the amniotic sac. As they described it, the fetuses made some gasping noises and seemed to struggle a little before it died. These experiments, these fetal experiments, were published in the New England Journal of Medicine shortly thereafter, which New England Journal of Medicine is headquartered in Boston. So the Boston City newspapers picked this up. It seemed very inflammatory that just overnight, researchers would almost immediately start doing fairly sensational, controversial experiments on human fetuses. So there was a lot of consternation and fury in Boston. Right about this time, a young teenager, which we'll call Alice Rowe to protect her anatomy, came to Boston City Hospital, requested an abortion. It was very late. The attending, whose name was Hugh Holtrop, asked her if he could do an experiment on her to see if a certain drug crossed the placenta to her fetus. This was done for a day or two. She consented, as many poor patients do, are getting free care. And then the abortion was scheduled for the next day. Holtrop had a private practice, so he asked his resident, Kenneth Edelin, to do the abortion. Now, Kenneth Edelin was an interesting character. He had gone to Columbia University. Then he had gone to Meharry Medical College in Nashville. I believe he went on an Air Force stipend. I think the Air Force paid for it, because after he graduated from Meharry, he served in the Air Force as a physician for 3 or 4 years. So he was a little bit older than most OBGYN residents when he started at Boston City Hospital. Normally, before you do this abortion, you test the amniotic sac by injecting a little bit of fluid. When Edelin did this, he drew blood. This meant that the fetus was in what's called the anterior position. It was in the front of the uterus, and a normal abortion, where you inject a lot of saline fluid to expel the fetus, couldn't be done because this might inject the saline fluid into the mother and harm her. So the next day, Edelin scheduled a hysterotomy, an abortion essentially by cesarean. Before that, he did something a little bit odd. The normal person who would have assisted him was a fellow named Jimenez from Mexico, who was probably Catholic. Instead, he asked a third-year student named Steve Tisch to assist him. Maybe Jimenez was a little irritated by this, and he watched, evidently, from the window outside the surgery room. And what happened next is Edelin made an incision through the muscles. He opened up the uterus, and then, and this is the controversial part, he waited 3 minutes, which is a very, very long time, before he took out a dead fetus. Well, at this point, someone, probably Jimenez, alerted the local district attorney that a viable fetus, who may have been a human under the law, had been killed. Boston City Hospital required any large fetus, and this one was 600 grams, to be preserved in formalin. This was done, and there would later be a picture to show the jury. Now, a lot of DAs are elected, and the DA in Boston was one of these. He, a couple months later, constituted a grand jury that indicted Edelin for manslaughter, which was defined as reckless endangerment of a human life. A sensational trial occurred, one covered by a lot of media, including CBS and Gloria Steinem for Ms. Magazine. The district attorney argued that Edelin had essentially killed a viable fetus, and this was equivalent to, if not murder, certainly manslaughter. The judge instructed the jury that because of Roe versus Wade, Massachusetts law was controlling, but Massachusetts had no law about abortion. What Roe versus Wade said is that states may pass a law banning abortion after viability, which presumably Massachusetts would do. So the judge said viability is really a key issue, and whether you think this fetus was viable. The second thing he told the jury is that under existing Massachusetts law, there was a very big difference between a fetus, which is inside the womb, and a baby, which is outside the womb. Only a baby could be the subject of a manslaughter charge. This explains why, in a much later case of Lacey Peterson, who was very much pregnant and her husband shot her through the stomach, the DA had charged the husband with a double homicide, but the appeals court said no, it could only be a single homicide because the fetus was never outside the womb. It could never have been a baby, so it couldn't be a subject of a homicide charge. Well, the jury went in, agonized. It was probably composed of many people who had heard a lot about the case and Catholic, and they decided that even though the fetus had never been outside the womb, it could have been outside the womb, and it was probably viable, and Edelin had intended to basically kill a viable fetus, and they convicted him. Whoa, this sent shockwaves through medicine. There were some residents down in New Jersey in the Quinlan case who felt the chill. For the next 2 years, the case is on appeal. Edelin's hospital supported him. They continued his job. They paid for his lawyers. 2 long years later, the Massachusetts Supreme Court, which heard the case on direct review, as in the Quinlan case, basically acquitted Edelin. It said because the fetus had never been outside the womb, it could not have been the subject of a manslaughter charge, and therefore Edelin was innocent. Edelin was very relieved, as you might imagine. He went on to become chief medical resident at Boston City Hospital. He later was hired on the chief of staff. He later became chair of OBGYN at Boston City Hospital. He later also became dean for minority affairs and diversity at Boston University Medical School. He had a fairly successful career. And actually, he later became chair of Planned Parenthood nationwide. But the story doesn't really end there, because a physician named William Nolan, a surgeon, like a lot of people, had followed the case. And Nolan wrote a fairly famous or inflammatory book called The Baby in the Bottle, implying that the fetus was outside the womb and a baby. And Nolan's point ethically was essentially that the only thing Edelin had to do was take that fetus out, smack it on its fanny, cut the umbilical cord and see if it breathed. If it struggled to breathe, put it in an NICU, a neonatal intensive care unit, it would have flourished, someone would have adopted it, it would have had a life. And no one said because Edelin didn't do that, he was wrong, he was unethical. That was kind of where the case ended. About a decade later, the UAB invited its Department of Obstetrics Edelin to give a talk. I went. I was lucky enough to go out afterwards to take him alone to a local restaurant. I learned that at the time he was married to a philosophy professor, and we chatted, and towards the end, I brought up Nolan's scenario, and I said, why didn't you take that fetus out, smack it on the fanny, and see if it was, viable and it would live? I'll never forget what Dr. Edelin said to me. He looked me in the eye, and he said, Greg, the whole point of doing an abortion is that the mother doesn't want a baby. She wants a dead fetus. That's the whole point. I did what the mother wanted. And I don't think anyone has ever heard these words of Kenneth Edelin before. He did what the mother wanted. He produced a dead fetus. And by implication, his view is the point of doing a late-term abortion is not to open up the woman, see if the fetus is viable. No, the point is to produce a dead fetus. Edelin also had some other events in his life. He had a practice in Roxbury, a very poor section, a little bit west of Harvard Medical School, where a lot of poor black people lived. He was known throughout his life as a defender of women's rights, but he also argued that minority rights, rights of black people, and women's rights are very closely tied together, and you couldn't have one without the other. He died at age of 74 in 2013. Shortly thereafter, Boston University Medical School named a square in his honor. That's the story of Kenneth Edelin. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give me a thumbs up. Even better, subscribe. Thank you.